Hi, and welcome to this video lesson. Here we're going to be covering Chapter 4, Lesson 3, the process of photosynthesis in more detail. Please make sure that you read Chapter 4 for homework this weekend, if you have not done so already. So let's start off with our learning objectives. Our learning objectives are to explain what happens during the light-dependent reactions, explain what happens during the light-independent reactions, and then identify the factors that affect photosynthesis. Overall, there are two sets of reactions involved in photosynthesis. There is the light-dependent reactions and the light-independent reactions. Let's start off with a quick look into the light-dependent reactions. The light-dependent reactions are where chlorophyll absorbs energy from light and water is used in order to create oxygen gas as a product, as a waste product. We also get the production of NADPH and ATP, which are some high energy molecules. They provide energy to the light-independent reactions because these reactions don't use light energy. They use energy that's actually in molecules. Then we get carbon dioxide going into that light-independent reaction. Out comes sugars, and then the low-energy versions of these two molecules. So a brief overview of the light-dependent reactions is that they occur in the thylakoid. These thylakoids are little disc-like structures that are found inside of the chloroplast. So if you look at the little image, notice the chloroplast is inside of that plant cell. And they use energy from sunlight that gets absorbed by chlorophyll, which is a pigment, in order to produce ATP, NADPH, and oxygen. So again, notice how we are zooming in. So we have the leaf of a plant. Inside of the plant leaves, we have many different cells. These cells contain organelles that we call chloroplast. So this whole thing here is the chloroplast. Inside of the chloroplast, there is like a fluid-like substance called the stroma, and then these structures that we call thylakoids. This slide shows us a summary of the light-dependent reactions. Most important things to know is that the light-dependent reactions, they depend on energy from the sun or another source of light, and they produce oxygen. They also convert ADP and NADP+, which are low-energy molecules, into high-energy molecules called ATP and NADPH. There are 4 different steps to the light-dependent reactions. The first one is photosystem 2, followed by the electron transport chain, followed by photosystem 1. And then lastly, we have the hydrogen ion movement and ATP formation. Notice a few things here. The photosystems, that is where light energy gets absorbed. So photosystems have the pigment called chlorophyll because chlorophyll is actually the thing that absorbs energy from light. The electron transport chain basically moves high energy electrons from one place to the next. And then at the very end, we have the movement of hydrogen ions and the production of ATP. So let's look at photosystem 2. Photosystem 2 absorbs light energy by using the chlorophyll pigment that's in it. So it absorbs light energy and it produces high energy electrons. So these high energy electrons are actually in the chlorophyll. When the chlorophyll absorbs energy from light, it adds that energy to the electrons and it makes the electrons super high energy. So you can imagine they're super excited and they're ready to move, ready to transfer their energy. And so they enter into what we call the electron transport chain, which is just a series of these electron carriers. And so this yellow line is showing us that electrons start to flow along the electron transport chain. All right, you might be wondering, So if these electrons started going down the electron transport chain, can photosystem 2 do this process over again? Well, it actually can. It's able to replenish the electrons that it just sent on the electron transport chain by splitting water molecules. So photosystem 2 does a few things. It absorbs light energy using chlorophyll and makes high energy electrons. And it also splits water, a water molecule, into electrons, which it uses to replace the ones that it sent along the chain. It makes some hydrogen ions, which kind of stay within this space. Notice how there's a bunch of little H pluses. And it also creates oxygen gas. So this is actually the oxygen that goes out of the plant into the atmosphere, and we breathe in that oxygen. So after chlorophyll in photosystem 2 absorbs energy from the light and creates these high energy electrons, these electrons enter the electron transport chain. And the electron transport chain is a series of electron carrier proteins which shuttle or move high energy electrons during some ATP generating reactions. So what does this mean? Let's break it down. If you look at this image, we're zooming into this area here. The electrons that have lots of energy leave photosystem 2 and they go to these electron carriers. Some of these electron carriers are actually pumps. And so as these energized electrons go through it, they help pump hydrogen ions from the stroma into the thylakoid space. And so the stroma, remember, is the fluid that's inside of the chloroplast. And then, so the chloroplast has fluid in it, but it also has inside of that fluid some disc-like structures that we call thylakoids. And so this is basically taking hydrogen ions from the stroma inside the thylakoid. And this movement requires energy. So the energy from the electrons kind of gets used up there a little bit. Now the electrons reach photosystem 1. And photosystem 1 re-energizes these electrons because the electrons kind of used up their energy to help pump hydrogen ions across the membrane. And very similar to photosystem 2, photosystem 1 also has chlorophyll. The chlorophyll absorbs energy from the light and it re-energizes the electrons that are here on the electron transport chain. And now those electrons are able to continue through the electron transport chain. Eventually, those electrons, so here they are, they get picked up by an NADP plus molecule, which has low energy. And so the addition of, electrons plus NADP plus and some hydrogen ions, which are just floating around in the stroma, those all combine to form this very high energy molecule that we call NADPH. So this has high energy. This high energy molecule is going to be used later on in the light independent reactions to provide energy. The last part of the light dependent reactions is the formation of ATP. And so ATP is formed because at the very end of the light-dependent reactions, we reach this protein here. And notice how in the electron transport chain, hydrogen ions were being pumped into the thylakoid space. And they weren't being pumped there for no reason. They're pumped there in order to create a high concentration of hydrogen ions on the inside of the thylakoid compared to the low concentration of hydrogen ions in the stroma. So there's more hydrogen ions inside the thylakoid and less hydrogen ions outside of the thylakoid. So we have an area of high concentration and low concentration. And something in science is that things like to flow from high to low concentrations. So the hydrogen ions, they're going to flow through ATP synthase. And as they flow through it, they cause ATP synthase to turn and to spin. And this spinning motion creates ATP because it allows ADP to form a bond with another phosphorus, and it creates the high energy molecule called ATP. So now this high energy molecule also goes to the light independent reactions. A summary of the light dependent reactions is provided here. Overall, these reactions produce oxygen gas, and they convert ADP and NADP plus into the high energy carriers that we call ATP and NADPH. Now let's look at the light independent reactions. The light independent reactions also go by another name called the Calvin cycle. And this is where the ATP and NADPH that was produced in the light dependent reactions, so the energy in those molecules is now used to synthesize high energy sugars. So here we're going to be making sugars, otherwise known as carbohydrates. And on this slide, I want you to notice what's going to happen here. So starting off at the very top, carbon dioxide from the atmosphere enters into the plant, and it goes into the leaves, into the plant cells inside of the leaves. And then once it's inside of the cells, it goes into the chloroplast. And so now here we are. We have some carbon dioxide. It enters into the Calvin cycle, and it combines with some other molecules there in order to form a 12 carbon or 12 of these 3 carbon molecules. So there's 3 carbons in them because there's 3 little black dots. The 3 carbon molecules then use the energy from ATP and the energy from NADPH and those electrons in order to form sugars. And so the sugars, the name that we use for these sugars is actually called glucose. So sometimes you might hear me say glucose, you might hear me say sugar, you might hear me say carbohydrates. Photosynthesis produces glucose, which is a sugar, which is a carbohydrate. And so these sugars then go off into the cell and they get used up there in order to do different life processes. And I want you to notice that so now the ATP and NADPH, they gave up their energy. And so ADP and NADP plus go back to the light dependent reactions and they get reused again. So at the very bottom, we have that sugar compound that gets formed. That is one of the products of photosynthesis. So let's look a little bit deeper here. So carbon dioxide, once again, it entered into the Calvin cycle. And 6 of these carbon dioxide molecules are required. And they combine with 6 5-carbon molecules. And they produce 12 of these 3 carbon molecules. So hopefully you can see it there on the page. And in order to produce sugars or glucose, energy from ATP and high energy electrons from NADPH are used to convert the 3 carbon molecules to higher energy forms, which we call sugar or glucose. To summarize the light independent reactions, I want you to know that the 6 molecules of carbon dioxide are used to produce one single 6-carbon molecule, which is what we call glucose. And it uses the energy that was produced in the light dependent reactions earlier. And as photosynthesis continues to happen, The Calvin cycle removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and it turns it into energy-rich sugars. Plants then use these sugars to meet its energy needs and to synthesize other molecules that are used to grow and to develop. Some of these molecules are things such as lipids or proteins or complex carbohydrates. And so the plants use these molecules, but then also, since plants are primary producers, when a consumer comes along and eats these plants, it gets the energy and the nutrients in these molecules and is able to then use them to survive, to reproduce. And so let's finish off the light independent reactions and find out what happens to the NADP plus and ADP now that they gave up their energy in order to create glucose. So again, I want to highlight that the NADP plus and ADP, they're low energy. They go back to the light dependent reactions and this whole process starts all over again. All right, so on this slide, we're going to talk about what are some of the factors that affect photosynthesis. So some factors are things such as the temperature of the ecosystem, the light intensity, so is there bright light or is there not bright light? And then is there water available for these plants? So let's talk about the effects of temperature. So plants actually have certain temperature ranges where they work the best. So it's typically between 0 degrees Celsius and I believe 35 degrees Celsius. So basically freezing temperatures, so the temperature that water freezes, all the way up to around probably 90, 100 degrees, about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So temperature is super important because in order for these processes to occur in photosynthesis, we have certain enzymes, some structures that we call enzymes. And enzymes, they only work in certain temperature ranges. So if it is too hot or too cold, plants will no longer be able to do photosynthesis because the enzymes will stop working. So temperature can affect photosynthesis because plants are they're adapted to certain temperature ranges. And once it goes outside of the temperature range, the enzymes start to malfunction and photosynthesis doesn't happen. Light intensity affects photosynthesis because, again, photosynthesis depends on light. If there is not enough light, so if it's a very dim light, plants won't have enough energy to absorb and to energize the electrons, which then go through the electron transport chain. On the other side, if there is very bright light, that actually helps photosynthesis. So bright light increases the rate of photosynthesis until it's maxed out. After that point, any brighter doesn't really affect the plants, doesn't hurt it or help it really. Water is also super important to photosynthesis because remember, water replenishes the electrons that chlorophyll gives up into the electron transport chain. And so if there is no water available, then the electron transport chain would kind of stop and break down. So water is super important for photosynthesis for that reason. Lastly, I want to talk about two kinds of plants that are specially adapted to either extremely bright and hot conditions. We have the Ch4 plants and the CAM plants. So Ch4 plants have a specialized chemical pathway that allows them to capture carbon dioxide, even if it's at a super low level in the atmosphere. And so this carbon dioxide is able to then enter into the Calvin cycle and allows photosynthesis to keep on working. But this does come at some cost. It requires extra energy in the formation of ATP in order to function. And some common Ch4 plants are things that we actually grow on farms, such as corn, sugarcane, and sorghum. Next, let's go over the can plants. So can plants are a specific family of plants that are able to basically close up their leaves in order to prevent water from escaping. But if they close up their leaves, then that means they're keeping water in, which is good, but then that means they can't let carbon dioxide in. So they actually do something where they open their leaves at nighttime. They allow carbon dioxide to get absorbed into the leaf, and it stores the carbon dioxide there as an acid until it's daytime. In the daytime, these plants close the leaves to prevent water loss because they're typically found in very hot places and they want to keep as much water as possible. So they close their leaf in the daytime to keep water in, and they already stored up carbon dioxide at nighttime. So they're still able to do photosynthesis now that the light is there. C4 plants and can plants are definitely something you want to go back to the book so that you can read about these specific examples about these kinds of plants. And that is the end of this video lesson. Thank you for being here. Please ask me during class if you have any questions or anything is super confusing. We're going to continue talking about photosynthesis and practice it together. Again, make sure that you read chapter 4 from the textbook so that you have all of this information. All right, and I'll see you in class. Bye.